Welcome to the High Dimensional Podcast. In this episode, you'll hear a conversation Phil and I had with Vera Mucaj, former Chief Scientific Officer at Datavent. Vera has had one of the most interesting careers in healthcare data, spanning academia, consulting, and tech. In this episode, we discuss the power and limitations of real-world data, Vera's career, and advice she has for young people just getting started. A really exciting conversation you'll hear now.
Thank you for coming on today to be our inaugural guest on the High Dimensional Podcast with me, Phil Valentine, and Aaron Niederheiser.
Wow.
Yeah, so I think the best place to start would be to just ask you to give a quick introduction, and then I have a couple questions for you about the awesome paper that you recently posted about.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. It's great to see you both and be here, and looking forward to the series. So a little bit about me. I'm actually a biologist by training, spent about a decade in the lab as a cancer researcher, and I still consider myself a scientist first and foremost. And then I spent the last 7 years at what was then a very small startup and now a pretty large company called Datavent as their chief scientific officer and head of their life sciences products, where primarily my goal was to help folks build a product based on connected longitudinal healthcare data. As part of that journey, I consider myself a little bit of a convert in the health data world. And you guys know that adage, right? There's no zealot like the convert. One of the things that's happened during that journey is that I got really obsessed with the idea of healthcare data that's good. And good can mean a lot of things when it comes to data. It can mean complete, it can mean accurate, it can mean right, it can mean the right data for the right thing at the right time. And one of the things that I learned from all my customers, and they range the gamut, right, from life sciences, pharma, to analytics, to payers, providers, academics, the government, whether they were data sources or they were data users, they all had the same problem, which was they needed to answer questions. They couldn't answer these questions without the right data. And they would get the wrong answers if they had the wrong data. So how would we be able to help them in that journey? And that's been a great experience, and something that's I think makes me continue to be a health data evangelist even post my time at Datavent.
So, Vera, your background's so interesting. I was curious. So you were like you very much on the like academic scientific side of things. Did a PhD. What was your PhD in? Microbiology or
Cellular
something in
molecular
that?
biology, yeah, cancer research more or less.
And so and so you're doing this like cancer research stuff, and then was you at some point you made this pivot and you ended up spending some time at McKinsey. So how did just share a little bit about how that transition came around and how you like made the decision to like get out of academia and then get into like more of the business side of things.
Sure. And I feel like this kind of a decision is probably familiar to folks who've been in PhD programs. PhD program is a very long program. It was 5 years for me, but it can go all the way up to 7. And during that period, kind of like individuals and their interests change, right? I joined academia because I wanted to be an academic. I wanted to be a university professor, just like my mentor, and run my own lab. And at some point or another, I guess I learned about myself that I liked doing a little bit of everything, as opposed to focusing on just one thing and go very, very deeply in it. And hence the switch from academia into consulting. I consider consulting almost as a way to survey a large swath of industry without necessarily picking a career or a company. So my years in consulting, I served a lot of pharma companies, primarily around asset management and asset allocation and some clinical trial strategy. And I served private equity companies, so businesses that were licensing, buying, selling companies, and I learned a lot about different pockets of healthcare. But those years for me were more exploration years, and that is something that, you know, if there's any PhD students or folks in early career listening to this, whether it's consulting or whether it's something else while you're, you know, like you're doing your main thing, always look out there to see what's new, what's interesting, what might be sort of like better of a match for you. And for me, towards the end of my time at McKinsey, I had to make a decision. Did I want to join one of my clients and maybe work for a large pharma company or a private equity firm. And at that time, so this was late 2017, the CEO of Novartis was in the news saying, we're a pharma company, but we're not just a pharma company, we're a data company. And this whole idea of being a data company, even if you're in the life sciences, was very intriguing to me. And Datavent at that point was serendipity. I happened to know the founders for many years. They were starting a company to make a big dent in the health data world. And I was somebody who was intrigued by this idea. I wanted to learn more about health data, and that's how I ended up there.
That's awesome. And then you were essentially chief scientific officer at Datavent for most of your tenure or your entire tenure there. What were you primarily focused on in your role as chief scientific officer at Datavent?
Most of my tenure there, but actually, like, one of the things that I like about small startups is what I was before I was chief scientific officer, right? Which was a little bit of everything, like a jill of all trades. I remember when I joined Datavent, my goal was actually to, quote, sell our software to academics for free. So that connection with kind of like the academic group, for a company that really had not built a network yet, we wanted to make sure that folks who really saw the validity of it would use it first. But I also did things like redlining contracts, like doing operational items within the organization, doing some marketing stuff. And once we started getting a number of customers, we realized that we really needed to build an implementation team. So the first thing that I did at Datavent was actually be head of implementations.
Oh, wow.
And that's how I really learned how our technology worked, how our clients were using it, and what the gaps were. And from there, the role of chief scientific officer kind of evolved naturally. Datavent doesn't do any science, so I wasn't doing science as chief scientific officer. I was building product, and I was identifying use cases. And one of the first things that we recognized pretty immediately when we looked at our client base is that everybody except for one group was using it. A lot of people were trying to connect data, except for in the clinical trial space. So we were wondering, what does it look like to connect clinical trial data to other data? And would this be important? And that was one of the first use cases that I brought to life, and now a large business at Datavent around clinical trials. And when we first started there, if you went to a pharma manufacturer and you said, hey, we have a technology that can link data about your trial participants to other data about the same participants in the real world, and you can follow them longitudinally, the first reaction was actually, please don't touch my trial. And we actually had to make the case that not only is this data linkage technology privacy preserving, not only is it not limiting you in any way to have your, double-blind placebo-controlled trial, but it is also a great way for you to be able to have the utility of a very, very long trial that follows patients in their real world without actually running a very costly real-world trial. And actually making the scientific case, making the epidemiologic case, making even the health economic case for why clinical trial data should be linked to other data proved to be very, very fruitful. And now I believe all major pharma sponsors are implementing clinical trial linkage for the optionality of long-term follow-up in the future. So that's kind of how, I would say, the juncture point of how my career changed from being a jill of all trades at Datavent to being one that was very much product focused and use case focused.
Is the reason that you might be interested, so you're running a clinical trial, right? This is essentially a well-designed scientific experiment designed to answer specific questions and track or generate the data needed to answer those specific questions with a sample of patients that is designed to power the statistics to a certain degree to answer the question with a certain degree of statistical significance. Is the main value around joining other data, augmenting the clinical trial data with other data to answer kind of additional questions that the study that might be interesting beyond what the study was originally designed to answer?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about a pharma sponsors clinical trial data, It's probably the most strategic data that they have, probably the most expensive data that they can generate, and it's also the most siloed data that they have. I don't know if you've been part of clinical trials. I just in the process of like being a Datavent, I participated in two because I wanted to learn firsthand. But if you think about the whole enrollment and trial conduct process, participants enter a clinical trial. Maybe there's some information about their previous health history to establish the inclusion and exclusion criteria to make sure that those participants are relevant for the trial. Once they're in the trial, for a number of ethical and privacy reasons, you don't know any more information about them. All of their personal information gets stripped, and they're recognized with a subject ID, which is a randomly generated participant number. And that subject ID has absolutely no meaning in the physical world, in the real world, outside of that trial. So what happens when the trial completes, right? Like you either reach the endpoints or you didn't, the trial's complete, those participants go back to their lives. And at that point, you, as the researcher, as the person who's looking at trial analytics, as the pharma sponsor, might not have a way to recontact those people to see how they're doing 2 years, 3 years down the line. So that's what I mean when I say it's a siloed system. So a lot of really important data, as you mentioned, Aaron, a lot of like very specific data to answer a particular hypothesis or a particular endpoint is collected in the trial, but you don't know what else happened in their medical history before. You don't know how those participants were interacting with healthcare even during the clinical trial. And certainly you don't know longitudinally what happened after that trial, which is why, like once, certain trials are completed, regulators usually ask for a phase 4 study or a longitudinal follow-up registry to make sure that, the intervention that we're putting to market and we're approving continues to be safe and efficacious beyond the, let's say, 2 years that clinical trial ran for. And one example that I love, again, from my cancer biology world is this idea of many clinical trials in oncology have an endpoint of progression-free survival. So during the time of the trial, you're looking to make sure that that patient's, cancer doesn't grow bigger. And based on that, you can get an accelerated approval in many cases for that particular intervention. But really what's really, really important and what's gold standard in oncology is overall survival. The 5-year survival curve is one data point that's we're very familiar with. Not many trials run for 5 years. So how do you know 5 years down the line if those participants are still on that particular intervention and if they're doing well? And that is one thing that I think being able to connect data wherever is being captured, those particular participants are still seeing doctors, they're still seeing their community oncologist, they're still seeing their primary care physician. So how can you tell a story in not an extremely expensive way, not in an extremely cumbersome way, but that still gives you the answers that are relevant to patients and relevant to that disease in question?
I think that's a really good point, or a great example, like for the layperson that doesn't really understand what's going on. Because like if for the layperson, it's like you read about, new cancer drugs coming out, like immunotherapy drugs like Keytruda, and it's like, oh, these are like, breakthroughs for different types of cancer, lung cancer, whatever. But it's really the trials that led to the approval of those things. How long did those trials probably run for? Like 2 years, like a couple years at the most, right? And so then the question being like, what's the long-term impact on overall survival? It's not like we're actually running a 10-year trial to see what that is. So the ability to join back to real world data to answer that question is like actually the only way that's the only practical way we would be able to really answer that question, right?
Yes. And I mean, there might be kind of like anecdotal ways to answer it. Like if there's particular physicians that were involved as principal investigators in the study and they're still seeing patients. Like I've heard anecdotal stories of the first few Keytruda patients in, I believe, melanoma who are literally off the charts in terms of like survival. Like they've survived for much longer than 5 years, much longer than 10 years. And there's also like, granted, there's also like long-term registries that happen after that, but like in a comprehensive way, we don't have a way to really do the scientific study. Because the interesting thing, even with immunotherapies like Keytruda and others, is that they were life-changing for many participants, but not for everybody. And as a scientist, I'm always curious, what happened to those individuals who did not survive, who did not get better, even when their immune system was activated? Was there a particular mutation in their cancer that made it more difficult for them to be seen by the immune system? Did the drug itself not work in the immune system the same way we thought it would? Or was this something else that I can even hypothesize right now that was the case? Like maybe there's something about their socioeconomic impact. Maybe there's something about their nutrition that made it difficult for them to recover from cancer, for example. So I'm always very, very curious to know how we can do better patient stratification, not just to figure out and learn from the super responders, but also to see what the next drug, the next oncology drug should be for the non-responders.
Yeah, for sure.
That's a really interesting point. And I feel like, as coming basically entirely from a data background and being not very science aware generally, and coming into this field that obviously relies a lot on many aspects of science, my sort of question about that is, are there efforts being made to repurpose or sort of like continue the use of the data collected from trial participants, for example, using your example there of people who didn't respond, if there is biological samples or genomics information that are available from those patients. Obviously, the main focus of the trial is to determine if the drug is going to work, but are there then subsequent reuses of the biological and other data to try to find those correspondences between different mutations and the lack of response?
In some cases there are, but not consistently. And there might be a lot of reasons why that's not the case. Like you could think about first, sort of like who has the data and who has access to the data and who is sharing or not sharing the data. Some data for clinical trials continues to be very strategic, so I don't think it's broadly shared out there. Some other issues could be around the initial consent. So if a trial participant consented that their biological samples are used only for the trial as opposed to sort of like for secondary research, but maybe we don't have the right to do like the spatial transcriptomics and all of these new technologies that might not have been existing even when those samples were collected. And when it comes to samples, which is a very specific type of data, you also need to make sure that those samples were stored appropriately so you could do all of the genomic sequencing studies that you might need to do in the future. So there are a lot of little challenges, but I think they're all challenges that we can overcome. So being kind of a natural optimist, I do still see, and I'd love to see a universe where A, people are aware that you can do a lot more with data if you have the right data in the right place at the right time. And B, that people actually take action, and action sometimes is technology, but often that's not the biggest problem. Like companies like Datavent and others have solved some of the technology problems. A lot of the problems that I see are operational, are technical problems, are incentives problems that also could be solved, but maybe are not solved yet.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I feel like there's so much and understandable and warranted focus on ensuring that data is being used only for purposes that it is intended to be used for. But at the same time, it also kind of strikes me that if we have data that was generated through this process of participating in the clinical trial and we have this biological data, I've never seen much discussion about sort of an imperative to use that data as opposed to just being concerned about not using it for certain purposes. But if that data does exist, and the trial has concluded, the results are what the results are, it just seems like a huge waste to me to have those questions not be addressed later on. So is there a greater trend in consenting to open up the use of that data for other purposes than just the narrow purposes of that trial? Like, is that something that has increased in recent years?
I think informed consent forms are including a lot more language now. Like there's almost like an ICF, informed consent form 2.0, that I've seen where there's more language around secondary research use cases. So again, something that maybe as a participant in a clinical trial, it might not benefit you directly, but it might benefit scientific research down the line. And this is a personal opinion, but I agree with you, Phil, that we should, like, if the data is out there, particularly in the case of clinical studies or other research where those participants have already kind of like self-selected that they wanted to help medical research in some way. I think we do have kind of a moral imperative to use it, but to use it respectfully.
Absolutely.
The reason why I say with the moral imperative to use it is when that, as I mentioned earlier, when the data was collected, maybe some advancements in technology weren't even there. We can do genomic sequencing now at much lower cost than we could even 10 years ago. We can do much more than that now with proteomics, metabolomics. I mentioned kind of like spatial transcriptomics, which is a way to do things at the single cell level that's, like I couldn't even wrap my head around when I was a PhD student. And then we haven't said the word AI yet in this conversation, though I'm sure you hear it a lot. But there's a lot more that's been advanced on how we analyze data and how we connect the dots between something in huge data sets that maybe we wouldn't have been able to a few years ago.
So, like, sort of a naive question is like, what is actually the chain of what is like the data generating process or the chain of custody of the data? Like, so drug company is developing a drug. Maybe that's some really small biotech company, and then some bigger company kind of like partners with them to sponsor it and bring it to market, like Pfizer or Merck or somebody like that. They help fund the clinical trial process to bring the drug to market. And so they help with there's a cost associated with running the trial and with collecting the data. And those costs vary based on the complexity of the disease and what data collection is required, et cetera, et cetera. The actual collection of the data might be done by a contract research organization that is a type of organization that is just really good at running these trials, has relationships with the different sites and so forth. So but in that sort of model, the drug company that's funding the drug development would actually own the data. And like you were saying, Vera, this is kind of like the data is actually a strategic asset for them. And so it makes sense, and because it's such an expensive, potentially strategic asset to create, it makes sense that they would want to kind of control that from like an intellectual property standpoint. At some point, they end up preparing analyzing the data and submitting that to the FDA. What actually gets submitted to the FDA? Do they have to submit the raw data along with analysis? And so the raw data actually goes to the FDA, and then what is actually published on the open internet? Like, I'm guessing the raw data is oftentimes then not published because it is a strategic asset of pharma, and they kind of like see it as their IP. Is that more or less the case, or fill in the gaps for me?
That is more or less the case. I would say, like, talking about kind of like the cast of characters of a clinical trials, I think you got the majority of them. You mentioned the sites that usually end up being, let's say, like academic medical centers or hospital systems. Those systems, those sites themselves are also like a major player in this space. There's a principal investigator that may or may not also have access to that data after the trial is done for their own research purposes. But primarily, my understanding is the pharma sponsor is the owner of this data, even though the pharma sponsor themselves might not be responsible for collecting the data. They may be responsible for some of the analysis, but some other analysis happens in a blinded way from people who are removed and don't have sort of like a vested interest in that particular intervention being approved or not. I actually learned this very recently as I was talking to some former FDA commissioners, but not every regulatory body around the world actually sees the raw data. The FDA is very unique here in the United States. FDA scientists actually get the SAS files, like they get all of the raw data and the analysis and do the analysis on their own. That's my understanding, alongside sort of like the interpretation that came from whatever analytic company or CRO was working with the pharma sponsor. In some other jurisdictions around the world, they might check your math, but not necessarily get the raw data. So actually, like where the data sits, not to complicate things, but changes geographically as well. One thing that's exciting about FDA is that they do have quite a bit of that data. I again, like this is going maybe a little bit past my expertise. I don't think they have the samples that get collected, but they certainly have the data that is needed to make the case for whether a drug met its endpoints or not.
Well, pivoting slightly back more to the real world data and evidence space, a question that I often have, and I know we haven't gotten into the nitty gritty yet of the paper, and I promise that we will, but a question that I wanted to make sure to ask while we sort of have you is, what is your sort of 16,000 foot view of where we are in the evolution and adoption of real world data and evidence? Because from my understanding, this concept is relatively new in the, and obviously a lot went into the Cures Act 2016 to sort of spur the development and adoption of these methodologies and techniques. But would you say we're still sort of in the very early days? Are we in the part of the curve where things are still sort of increasing exponentially, or have we sort of started to level off and reach maturity and reach sort of the state that we're going to be at for quite a while?
Because of the potential that I think real world data has, I would say we're in the early stage. Like if you're thinking about Holy Grail, we're sort of like everybody who needs to has the complete and right data sets. I think we're still in early stages, in part because there's like a lot of nuances about how real world data is collected, stored, and assembled that's we still need, like as an industry, needs to work on. But in part also because a lot more data are becoming part of real world data right now. So if you think about medical claims as a fairly standardized, a fairly well aggregated in the United States form of data, I think maybe like we're a little bit more advanced there. But every time I look around, there's like data 2.0, data 3.0 that are coming online, including some of the omics data we just spoke about, but also wearables, data that kind of like sits outside of the standard four corners of healthcare. So I still think we're just scratching the surface. One thing that's that I think the FDA guidance and EMEA guidance and elsewhere really helped over the past 5 to 7 years was around kind of like setting up a baseline, like what is considered good in this space. And we'll never be able to have the same data as one can collect actively in a clinical trial out of real world data. Because real world data is primarily collected for either treatment or billing purposes, more or less. So we're never going to be able to have like that level of detail, but at least now we have guidance and we have a baseline for what good looks like. So it's not just about getting as much data as you can, collating it in a way, and then putting it out there for commercial and analytic use cases, is making sure you understand that every single step of data collection, that you are doing it right, that you are interpreting the results that came out of that data in the context that data was built for. So I would say we're still early stage. The past 7 years, I've seen kind of like night and day changes, but like that's because we've been zooming in kind of like on the lower end of the S curve, and it still looks like it's going exponential. I think especially like as we're getting more folks to agree that we need to share data and we need to collaborate around data, and especially as technology is advancing around kind of like the cleaning, standardizing, normalizing, and analyzing the data, we're going to see a lot more. I'm very hopeful.
So obviously one of the main differences between clinical trials and data and observational data is the lack of randomization and observational data, real world data versus clinical trials. Does FDA's guidance, or I guess just to follow on that, and the impact of that is essentially the way we get at causality through clinical trials is basically based on that randomization. So the fact that there's not that randomization in clinical trials introduces potential confounding. In the guidance that FDA has released, did they talk about that issue, or what does FDA have to say about that?
They've talked about that issue quite a bit, and even if you hear the last couple of commissioners talk about randomized controlled clinical trials, you'll hear, especially from Dr. Califf, the outgoing FDA commissioner, you'll hear that RCTs are magic. They're incredibly powerful. You can't set up in the real world the kind of studies that you could as part of an RCT. but you can approximate it as much as possible. And there's actually been a number of demonstration studies based in part from, like the FDA giving kind of the challenge that we need to make sure that we're not introducing bias in our analysis. There's been a number of studies that have, I think there was one called maybe the Replicate study that looked at how real world data studies were mimicking or duplicating what was seen in clinical trials. And I think they saw, maybe we would check this in the show notes, but I think they saw about like a 75% concordance there. But that's pretty much as much concordance as you see across clinical trials as well. So I would say like being able to actually like demonstrate that by looking at real world data, if you do it appropriately, you can get pretty similar results as if you were to do a trial, should give some sort of confidence in this space. I think ultimately the answer really, Aaron and Phil, will be that we know that we have this really powerful access to data as part of real world data. And we know that there's some problems with it. We know it's never going to be a clinical trial. We know it's never going to be perfect, but we still are able to get answers in the context of that data. And just like with any scientific publication, there should be like a discussion section that says, here's the perils of using this data. Here's some confounders that might not agree with our answer. So I say we use it for what it is, and we use it well, and we use it consistently, but that we acknowledge all of the limitations that come from real world data.
And in some sense, does that just come down to effect size? Like the probably the most famous result in epidemiology is like smoking is bad,
Mm-hmm.
right? And and obviously the analyses that demonstrated that were all like observational real world analyses, but it was just that the effect size, it was just like in the data, it was so unambiguous that it had all these negative effects on lung cancer and cardiovascular disease that it was like, yeah, we don't need to randomize here. It's just like bad in every case. Is that kind of what, do we have to kind of lean on the effect size to be big in real world data to some extent?
The effect size can help, but I think there's going to be very few healthcare findings that have sort of like such a slam dunk delta as those smoking and lung cancer studies. Not only did you see the delta there, but one of the things that always fascinated me about those studies is the curve looking at males versus females. Women started smoking much later than the men, and their lung cancer incidences also followed much later in time. So like when I saw that study, I was like, wow, this is not only like such a huge result, but also like pretty well correlated with this one event, which was smoking, because nothing else really distinguished those cases of lung cancer besides the fact that these populations started smoking at different times. There's very few things where we can expect or hope for such a huge effect. I think most cases, like when you look at some particular endpoint in observational studies and real world data, the answer might be a little bit closer. And I think that's where actually looking at how the data was collected, how the data was interpreted is super important. Because one thing that kind of I always bring up as an example in clinical trials is if you're looking for a particular, in real world data, if you're looking for a particular endpoint and you don't see it, is it because it didn't happen? Or is it because it happened and it's not captured in the data that you're looking at? Maybe you're looking at data from one particular health system. I live in Philadelphia. I get seen by the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania, but I also get seen by Jefferson, right? And if my endpoint happened when I was seen in one hospital versus the other, and you're only seeing data from one hospital system, then you might get the wrong answer or the wrong impression. So that's what I mean when I say, like, let's make sure that whatever data we're looking at it in the context that it was collected, and we're interpreting it appropriately.
So I'm curious, like, how in my experience, which admittedly is kind of gated and limited, I was just talking recently to a friend who is also in the rural data and evidence space, and we were talking about how there is all of this availability in theory of data sources like consumer data or even things that would be available from credit bureaus and things like that. it doesn't seem to me like that data is being utilized a ton. And I wonder if our big challenge is that we all know that there are things that are not captured in medical claims that are not going to be there in EHR data due to the fragmentation among health systems and stuff. And also there are just sort of like latent variables about people that are not really captured that well in those sources, even if you had, every record out there from the EHR, every record from claims. So why maybe aren't we seeing like, your propensity score variable based on my Amazon history? like why are we, that is that, would you agree with that doesn't seem to be highly adopted yet? Or like, I guess that was A, and then B, um, do you think that would provide utility if it was to be adopted to kind of address those like, unobserved variables, hidden variables challenges?
Yeah. So I going back to like the S curve, the adoption curves, I think the linkage of what I would call standard healthcare data, so like claims, CHR labs, to other kind of like secondary data sources that might say something about your health, but are not, healthcare data, like financial records, like socioeconomic, demographic data. We're seeing, I actually have seen and supported a number of use cases where those data were being linked together. It's still much less than like your standard, like let's aggregate all specialty pharma data to each other. So we're seeing some of it. So it's not happening at all. It's just much earlier in the adoption curve. And then the second question of why it's not happening, I think it's the same as what we've been talking about. There's kind of like a data use rights and data access. To my understanding, I don't think Amazon is putting all of their consumer data that they're collecting from all of the clicks that we do on Amazon.com out there for researchers to use. Maybe they are in some cases, and I'm just not familiar with it. So there's a trove of data that's just not out there in the open to be used. That's also, or at least not accessible to every researcher. That's also part of the equation here.
And you mentioned earlier, something that really resonated with me about some of these things not necessarily being technology limitations or challenges, but being related to sort of ways of doing things, incentives, and these other like administrative challenges. Other than data availability and data use rights, I'm just curious, especially given your background, not just as a scientist and a product focused tech person, but also from sort of the operational and institutional examination lens that I'm sure is very core to what people do at places like McKinsey. Like, what is sort of your diagnosis of those major challenges that are holding back, that are not just technology and data and use rights related?
If I had a magic wand of what to solve for that had nothing to do with kind of like the science of data or the technology of it, I would try to find a way to accelerate getting together every decision maker who needs to say yes or no to something happening. So in pharma, we run for our customers like a number of workshops explaining the technology and what we're trying to do, and they brought people from every kind of like business unit who might be interested or who might get a vote on whether like this technology was used for linking data or not. In health systems, it was even more complex. There's layers and layers of approvals that you need to have before data from a health system goes out. And I'm going to preface this by saying it makes a lot of sense that we should be judicious with how data moves, especially considering how sensitive health data is for people. So I understand why there's lots of checks and balances and lots of individuals involved. But in my experience, the number of individuals involved in making a decision, particularly in health systems or other type of kind of like large conglomerate health data sources, is really, really big. So if we can find a way to convene them in one place, to educate them in one place and be able to answer all their questions, like if I was a researcher and I wanted to use my hospital systems data, it might take a year, it might take 18 months before I can even get all of the people in one place to be able to get approval. So there's the human components to it that I think we need to work on as well.
And so is that, just like drilling down on that, is that literally, it sounds like primarily an issue almost of just like cognitive overhead of like, there's a lot of these veto players, there's many people that you need to get lined up together and aligned. And in order to do that, you have to get them to share an information context and explain the decision, and then get like it's really just a matter of decision power in the organization.
Yeah, exactly. There's decision power, there's the decision makers, and then there's kind of like a cascade of things that happen either before or after a decision is made around security review, privacy, IT, et cetera, et cetera. This
Yeah.
is like this is around reaching an agreement that data should be shared, and then there's the actual physical work and labor of sharing that data and analyzing that data, and technology is actually like doing quite a bit of progress there.
And do you find a similar challenge? Because I completely agree with you about judiciousness and the use of the data. And that absolutely makes sense, especially as it relates to an institution making a decision about putting their data out onto, well, first of all, not putting it out, but like making it available in some fashion on a privacy preserving network. But do you also see the same challenges when it comes to the decision to use data that's out there? Like, not even talking about having data flow out, but bringing more data from the outside and bringing products that integrate that data from the outside into their processes. Like, is it a similar challenge, or are there additional or other factors that kind of impede those decisions?
I think it's a similar challenge. Like if you're thinking about a network where on one side you have data sources and on the other side you have data users, some of the same challenges kind of apply to both. Like a data source needs to make certain decisions on whether they will get into a partnership with a data user. All of the stuff that I just mentioned in the health system example. But the data user itself also probably gets bombarded with like all of these different options, both on types of data and on analytics tools to be able to make sense of that data. So the diligence involved in figuring out what's the right data for you at the right cost, at the right latency, and what analytic tool makes sense for you and your team. Also, like there's like individual and group labor that goes into that also increases kind of like the time before you're even able to do something with data.
And I promised the last one before I pass the ball back to Aaron. From your experience as a product builder, are there product decisions or certain ways of thinking about incorporating those aspects into the product analytical products, as opposed to just, hey, here's some data that can influence that? Or what sort of like general strategies have you seen work when trying to address that problem, from getting people to use data, not necessarily trying to have data, a bi-directional data flow?
The advice that I give every single product manager that's building kind of like around software around healthcare data is that your customers don't necessarily wake up every day to use your product. They wake up every day to get the insights that they need. And your product can be helpful in that, or it could be a hindrance. So build something that is simple, that is easy to understand, that is easy to use, literally like fewest clicks as possible, and then build kind of the infrastructure behind it. And by infrastructure, I don't mean just like the software hardware infrastructure, but also like the documentation that you need to make sure that people trust and want to use your software, and preemptively and proactively, I guess, address some of the questions that maybe not just the buyer but all of the ecosystem around them might have. So what would the head of privacy, what would the head of legal, what would the head of IT say about your particular product? So it's not about your product, it's about the end result that the customer should get.
And the last corollary to that question is, because I am absolutely not a product person, I'm a data engineer.
Oh, come on, Phil. Sure you are.
About documentation, because this is kind of a hobby horse for me. Do you have any tips on how to get people to actually read documentation? Because how are ways that you can be presenting documentation to make it compelling or accessible to those audiences? Because I think probably something that many of us have experienced, I certainly have, is that it can be difficult even to get folks to engage with documentation for like a B2B tool that is part of the core tooling that they're using every day. So if you're trying to actually go out and engage with customers for documentation, actually, I guess, Aaron, you do this much more so than I with Tuva. Even like, how do you do that? How do you actually get documentation that will help further those goals?
I'd love to hear your guys' perspective, but from my point of view, you have the most detailed documentation that you should have out there for the individuals who want that detailed documentation, who will read it and who will listen to it. And then almost, I wish every product's documentation, every Zendesk article out there had a TLDR that says, here's the particular like answer that you're trying to get. Some of the AI summarization that's happening right now is helping with that. I can tell you, like, I don't have all the time in the world to read everything that's sent my way in my personal life. So I use some of these summarization tools in my personal life, and I think we should encourage product managers and product leaders to and implementations folks who are supporting ultimately to put some of those tools and those like TLDR type of too long did not read type of summarizations out there. Because ultimately, if the customer thinks your explanation is too long, if they're not able to self-serve, what do you think is going to happen next? One of two things. Either A, they're going to go to your implementation team and your implementation team is going to be overburdened, or B, they're not going to use your product, which is, I think, even worse.
You just had a paper published in Nature on some of the patient matching work that you did while you were at Datavent. Tell us a little bit about the paper and the journey to get that published.
Yeah, so it was a review paper in Communications Medicine, which is a Nature journal that focuses a lot on sort of like a broad variety of topics. And there was a pretty long backstory to it. It took us, I think, 2 to 3 years to get this paper published because we wanted to have something that was very comprehensive and that went through peer review, where those peers were scientists who were unknown to us, who might not have been experts in the field. We wanted something that passed the muster of those reviews, that would be trusted and read by a number of folks who might not be in the field of healthcare data. And the impetus for the paper was twofold. One, I'm very thankful to Datavent's founder, Travis May, who always wanted to make sure that we work with academics. And the challenge that he gave me as chief scientific officer was to have thousands of papers out there that used linkage technology so that, we could evangelize for it in academic circles. And my negotiation back to him was, how about one that's really, really good? And that's what we did. We got together and collaborated with two fantastic scientists, Dr. Karen Eisinger, who at the time was a cancer researcher at the University of Pennsylvania and now is the CEO of Cizanca, a cancer drug discovery company, and Dr. Abel Coe, who is at Northwestern University, and they brought two different perspectives. So while Abel Coe is a luminary in the field of healthcare data linkage and has studied this for quite a bit of his career and really, really knows this space, Karen was somebody who came from more of the basic research side, and her insight was, hey, nobody in my circles actually knows that you can do this with data. So if we want to actually really accelerate the adoption of data for insights and healthcare data linkage for getting better data, we need to tell folks that this can be done. And the way you tell folks that something can be done is by doing comprehensive review. So Karen and Abel banded together and put their knowledge and their historical knowledge and effectively did a pretty compelling history of healthcare data linkage, starting from like the early days of the census in the United States and ending with sort of like some of the privacy and data matching challenges that we've solved. And then my team at Datavent contributed some of kind of like the technical fine points for the review and a few of the use cases that came from the public sector. So it took 2 years to amass all of this information, to go through back and forth review processes, to see all of the interesting questions that the peer reviewers had. But I keep saying it's like my Datavent swan song. It got published a couple of weeks ago, and I am glad that it's out there in the world, and I hope as many researchers who need to see it get to see it.
Well, I can say from my experience, like I have talked to a number of people who are really deep in health data and just were not, but not real world data and evidence, and just were not aware of what tokenization is. And so now it's awesome to have this resource that I can send to them and have it be explained very succinctly and authoritatively
What?
for that purpose. So it's super exciting to see that. And then also people just outside, I think like I've even had discussions before with people who were interested in pursuing research sort of tangentially related to health, like linking cancer registry data with environmental data for an environmental PhD dissertation. And I do you see similar question about the S curve? Like, do you foresee sort of an explosion in the adoption of tokenization across lots of new domains in the near future?
Yeah, I see an explosion of data linkage and data connectivity, and tokenization is like one technology that can get that done. One of my clients actually called it the penny drop moment. Like we all go through life with like all of these assumptions about what we can and cannot do. And when somebody explains that, look, like there are data out there that you can put together, that you can stitch together, that helps you with your particular question, like that's the penny drop moment. And I think the more folks know about the possibility, the more folks will use it, the more scientific papers will come out there that have interesting and compelling results that use data linkage. You go in the materials and methods of those papers, you see it, and there's kind of like this positive flywheel.
Yeah, it's really exciting. We'll definitely link to the paper in the show notes. Um, we just have a couple minutes left, and I'm really curious. Kind of two things, Vera. So what are you doing now? I know you're a venture partner at Flex Capital. What are you doing now? And I guess related to that is kind of like, what are you really excited about? And that could be, I'll just leave it really open ended. You can answer that however you want.
Sure. So leaving Datavent left me very excited about the potential of all sorts of advancements that are happening right now to improve human health. So the primary thing and the primary reason why I left Datavent was to actually start a biotech company. So I'm in the early stages of ideation, of putting together a team that solves big problems in regenerative medicine and stem cell therapy, and solves those problems without the risk of causing cancer, which is what my scientific background is on. So I've spent the past 3 months ideating on that, talking to folks who are experts in that space, talking to folks who are entrepreneurial in other adjacent spaces in biotech. And it's been a lot of fun. I think it's been kind of like a quarter that I thought was going to be a sabbatical for me, but it's been a fantastic one for learning. And as part of this, I do also some small angel investments myself, and I have partnered with Flex Capital to do a little bit more VC work. So like as I see fantastic opportunities out there and fantastic entrepreneurs, both in biotech and health tech, I want to make sure that they also get funded. So that's kind of what I've been part of. And I guess the second thing is I've talked to so many awesome folks and have had some ideas that are brain worms for me, but I might not be able to practice them in my company in real life. I'm putting together a blog series that talks about those ideas as thought experiments. And I hope other people kind of get inspired by that, similar to the review that we just talked about, and capture those ideas and start other companies around them. So stay tuned for that as well.
That's really exciting. You got a ton of stuff going on. I'm excited to have you back for round two in the future and see how it's all going.
Awesome. I'd love to.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. I think I just realized I promised I would ask you a question. And so I have to, although we may cut Aaron's amazing segue into the outro to actually be the real outro, I just want to make sure to ask this. So as someone who went from a PhD into consulting and technology and now a lot of really cool other things that we just talked about, I know that there are a lot of people out there who, with all the upheaval going on, are either potentially staring down the barrel of leaving their PhD, not potentially being able to go into academia as they had hoped, or maybe even thought that they were on the path to a PhD, but that path is not looking amazing to them right now. So I'm just curious, like, what sort of like skills and or like what would you say to folks who are kind of contemplating that decision, who are facing down that decision about what things that you learned in your PhD, or sort of what habits of mind and other things that what have you found valuable in your later career pivots, and kind of what would you kind of say to those folks? Because I know that, especially I'm here in Boston, and my partner is plugged into academia, is teaching at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. So there's like a lot of people that I know who are in those shoes, who might be interested to hear something from someone like yourself that really did that.
First of all, I will acknowledge that it's a tough time to be in academia and to be starting or continuing PhD programs right now. I joined my PhD during the Great Recession, and I think this is 10 times tougher. So I want to acknowledge that. So like if you feel like things are complex and complicated in the academic world, they are right now. Funding stuff, opportunities are tough. So I want to acknowledge that. In terms of how you kind of like get around it, talented people are talented people, whether they're in PhD programs or doing something else. So I would say look at what's out there in the world where you can make a contribution, and look at something that really, really excites you and work really, really hard at it. And you'll get your real world PhD as part of doing that, and doing that well. In terms of skill sets, if I were to have that magic wand and go 10, 20 years back, besides investing in Bitcoin, I would say network a lot. learn from people who are not just in your field, without necessarily having an expectation that you'll get something from them. Just learn from them, and communicate thoughts out there. There's a lot more opportunities to actually publicly share your knowledge today than there were 10 or 20 years ago. Start your own Substack. Do like an X thread that's interesting. Learn something new and share it out there with the world. You'll be a lot more marketable if more people know that you exist.
Well, thank you so much. That's I'm sure that'll be useful to some folks. And thanks again for taking the time today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Vera.
All right.
See ya.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the High Dimensional Podcast. If you liked it, we'd love it if you could leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. Soon we'll be back with more exciting episodes at the intersection of healthcare, data, and AI. We hope to see you soon.